So welcome back to 11-minute lessons. Hopefully you'll have a sheet. We're continuing this series on how God is at present in the world. How is God in the midst of what's going on? Last week we looked at Thomas Aquinas and this idea of first and secondary causes. Like with Eric playing the organ, Eric would be the first cause of the music. The organ is the secondary cause. If the organ's broken, the music's not going to happen, or if it's faulty. But it comes through Eric. So God would be the primary cause, and humans in natural order would be the secondary cause. So when we think about loving someone, God is the primary cause of that love, because God is love. All love comes from God. That goes through us to others. God chooses to use these secondary causes, so through a series of cause and effect. So if you listen to the presentation last week about scholarships for Pakistani students, you might be inspired to give, and that may change a life. So through a series of cause and effects, what allowed that to happen? Here you go, Kathy.
Thank you.
So it might be because you listened to the thing, and then why did Nancy share? What led it all to happen? So a series of multiple cause and effects bring about somebody changing a life through a scholarship. So that's kind of Aquinas' primary and secondary causes. Sometimes God goes around the secondary causes, but often God uses them. Today we're going to talk about something called process theology. It's a whole school of theology put on half a page. So it's going to be quick a little bit. And some people, it's considered heresy, non-orthodox, but it's an interesting take on things, so I wanted to bring it up because it has some really attractive stuff to it, and some people really latch on to it. So there's good and bad to it. So process thought. In process theology, reality is seen as something dynamic and not static. Reality happens. God, while imperishable, fully participates in reality and thus can affect reality's course, change how things work, but is in turn also affected by it. Now this goes with what we talked about several weeks ago with Can God Suffer, that we can affect God. God can be sad. God can be disappointed. That is affecting God. Our choices, the things that humans do, can affect God. So God is considered an influence in process theology. God is considered a sympathetic influence on creation reality. The idea of a sympathetic influence avoids the notion of God as power and absolves God from responsibility for the evils or failures in the world. And a lot of these other schools of theology, ultimately, when you keep peeling back the layers, if God is the creator of everything, and everything is a result of what God has done, you have to in some way tie evil back to God. Either because God gave us free will, some schools of thought God actually creates evil, or it's the absence of good, but then that causes it. So some way or another, it gets tied back to God. In this theology, it doesn't get tied back to God. God, according to this view, may attempt to influence events within the process. God is viewed as a creative participant in the cosmos. However, the notion of God controlling events is quite unacceptable to this model. We've talked about that. God isn't necessarily omnipotent, controlling every little single thing, because that takes away from God's primary motive of wanting to create, having freedom and love. If God controls everything, nothing is actually meaningful. If someone has to love you, that love isn't meaningful. If someone has to do what you say, their obedience means nothing. Evil is thus not ascribed to God. Nevertheless, the models seem to evacuate God of most of the traditional notions of divinity. Some of these other things of God being sovereign over everything, controlling, causing many to be skeptical concerning their theological credentials. So it's very different than what we often think about with theology. Now, when you look at the Bible, it actually seems to work a lot with it, because God is said to create the world, but nowhere does it say God created the entire reality. And Genesis talks about God ordering the chaos. Something was there before the creation of the world. So is God one of the super powerful beings that exists within reality and then chooses to create the world, but not reality, thus not making everything up to God? The Bible doesn't actually get into those things. A lot of the things we think are just philosophical ideas that we've been traditional, that we've assumed for so long, but the Bible isn't clear on a lot of things. The Bible doesn't care about some of those things, to be quite honest, because that goes maybe deeper than it wants to go. But we do see in the Bible God often trying multiple things. Well, that didn't work, I'll try this. God's saying, How long I've lamented this, wicked generation. I've sent you prophets and signs, and you see God sometimes getting a little bit frustrated with people, rightly so. That seems to tie in with processed thought. Now, other people will argue, well, that's just the humans writing it from their point of view, but God really had this plan all along and decided from the beginning that God would do these things, knew they wouldn't work, and eventually do this. But the question is, why would God go through the issue of incarnation and suffering and dying on the cross if God could just control everything and say, boom, sin fixed? But God entered into the process to effect it. So someone argued that shows God is somewhat limited and God has to enter the process. Others say God chose to enter the process to show more investment in people and not just fix things from above. Is there one right answer? The Bible doesn't say clearly this is why God's motivation for these things. So this is one school of thought meant to kind of answer some of these questions. So does God mean control? So for God to be God, must God be able to control creation? Could God have created a world, but not reality itself? What do you think of God being an active player in reality along with us, able to influence, strongly influence, but not control? A God who affects and is affected by the cause and effect of reality just as we are. I finally got around to watching the latest Marvel movie, Eternals. And so in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, for those who watch, there are these beings called Celestials. And they tend to create these worlds and have a whole lot of power. And they were around from the very beginning, but they weren't the creators of reality itself. And so while they can control a whole lot of things, they can't control everything. They have a ton of power to create people and worlds and other Celestials, but their plans can be hampered by a plucky group of heroes. Who would have thought? So in some ways, Eternals kind of mimics this process thought of you have super powerful beings that can be a sympathetic influence, but they aren't the end-all, be-all, ultimate final power, if that makes sense. If you've watched Eternals, it probably makes more sense. If you hadn't, that's probably really confusing and weird to you. So, what does this mean for God's presence? A God outside of creation and outside the limits and effects of reality could be considered not to be as fully invested in creation as a God who is a part of the process with creation. If God is part of the whole process of reality, God's presence is required, whereas if God is the controller or creator of reality, then God's presence within it isn't required. Like the deist model, where it's like the watchmaker, God makes the watch, steps back, God makes the world, steps back. In that model, God didn't have to be present. In process thought, God's in the midst of it all. We've talked about this before in the past. I have 3 minutes, since for those timing me. This guy Jürgen Moltmann, this theologian, after World War II, saw all the devastation of his hometowns in Germany from the bombings, also the concentration camps and Holocaust. He was like, man, where is God in the midst of this? And ultimately he decided God isn't the writer of the story. God isn't just the audience watching, isn't the critic just watching what happens and deciding if it was good or bad. God ultimately is the primary actor. But often we think we're the primary actors in creation and God's watching or directing. He said, no, God is the primary actor in creation, and we are all the supporting actors, kind of taking our cues from God, listening to God, being affected by God, but God is the ultimate player in reality. Now, Moltmann wouldn't say he would be a process theologian, but his kind of conclusion matches with this a little bit. So what I think it's helpful is, you may not say, I'm going to go all the way into process theology. There's a whole bunch of books on it, so this is a very small snippet. But maybe it's helpful to think of, at least in some ways, is where God, with Aquinas, God is using secondary causes. Maybe it's also helpful to consider God's in the midst of it, often trying to figure it out with us. And maybe that's why often it took a while to get to the Messiah, and while other things were tried first. You had the Noah's Ark story. Well, that didn't work. Let's start over again. It seems that God is involved in the process. Does that make you feel good about things? Sometimes it's nice to think God is involved with it and figuring it out with the rest of us. On the other hand, it can be like, I don't have it figured out. I was hoping God did. But if God doesn't, who has it figured out? That can also be a bit disturbing. so as I said from the beginning, it doesn't have to be all one or the other. Maybe you can take little bits and say, okay, well, maybe God is more involved in the process than I originally thought, but somehow God is still more sovereign than process theology says. And God still uses secondary instruments, but sometimes just goes around and has miracles. They can hold multiple of these kind of in tension with each other to kind of get to where you believe God is really at work in the world and how. We'll look at one more model next week of how theology is kind of considered this, and then we'll kind of dive into that larger question we've been slowly getting to. Why do bad things happen? If God is all good and all powerful, why do bad things happen? We've kind of questioned now, is God all powerful with the Omnipotent series. We'll kind of look at what it means to be good, but understand more about the problem of evil. What is evil? Where does it come from? And knowing a little bit of process theology, in one model, it's not God's fault. In other models, God allows for evil to take place, or in some, God even creates it in the first place. Any questions? I'm under 11 minutes. When we got to questions, that's what we guarantee. Questions allow for more discussion. Any questions about process theology? It's a whole year's worth of a course in like 11 minutes, so I'm sure you have it all figured out by now. It's dipping your toe in a little bit into. The main guy who invented it was a guy named Alfred Lord Whitehead. Alfred Lord North Whitehead. So you can read more if you want. But otherwise, look forward to seeing you next week. We won't have 11-minute lessons on the 13th because we have the annual meeting afterwards. Thank you all very much.